Welcome to What's Your Story podcast. I'm your host, Matt Story. On this pod, I sit down with people of color leaders to understand how they've been able to use their superpowers to make an impact on our world. And I do it one story at a time. My guest on the pod this week is a visionary strategist for the digital age. She's a web and TV personality, a best-selling author, and the award-winning CEO of Zen Media, which is a global marketing and digital PR firm. She's also been honored by the White House and the United Nations as one of the top 100 young entrepreneurs in the country. So needless to say, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about her story. And please welcome Shama Hyder to the show.
Matt, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for taking the time and jumping on the mic. Before we get into all that goodness of all the amazing things you've been able to do and the work you've been able to contribute to, I wonder if we could take a step back and maybe you could share a story with us about what little Shama may have been like.
You know, my sister always says that I remind her of Dora, the little cartoon with the monkey in the backpack. And I think it's really apt because little Shama always had a plan. Little Shama always had like some busy, like I had things to do, right? Like 7 years old. It's like, what do you have to do? What do you have to do? I would say curious and very undaunted. And so one of my early report cards, because I moved to the US when I was 9 years old with my parents. So I am a first generation immigrant. And one of the report cards said, I still remember, said, the other kids are mean to Shama, but she doesn't care. She just seems to find other things to focus on. And I thought that was very apt for little Shama, and it's very true for big Shama too, where I'm just not very daunted by, with sort of the naysayers and as you get older, even by the praise, right? So like I always just sort of have this one track mind. The teacher said very goal oriented. I think from a young age, I figured out that there will be people who dislike you or for whatever reason don't. You sound different, you look different, you wear petticoats to school, and that wasn't not very accepted back in the in middle school. And so I think little Shama was, if that answers your question, would.
That's a very very difficult age to transition, and doing the math, you're kind of into your primary school, going into middle school. And the only thing you want to do is fit in, and to come to a new school, a new place, probably so many new things you were exposed to. Like, how did you navigate that? And like, what do you think allowed you to stay undaunted? Because I personally, not quite to that extreme, had a transition in that time frame. That was challenging. And it was like, you just want to be like everyone else. You don't want to stand out. And unfortunately I stood out. So I'm curious, how did you navigate that?
So interesting, Matt. So I don't think I ever cared about fitting in. I never felt like I needed to belong, right? And maybe because, again, as mentioned, being a first generation immigrant, my parents had come here from India, and there were so many challenges at home and such that I just felt like I had bigger battles to fight than the kids at school. It was like, fitting in was very low on my priority list when my parents were worried about putting food on the table, and they had these very real life, right, challenges, and you compare that to like a 10-year-old's whatever, so I think weirdly enough, even being so young, I just had that kind of perspective where I thought, this doesn't matter, and this is not going to matter in a couple of years. But my parents, trying to do this for my sister and I and family, and trying to fit in and make a living, like these are the important things. So I think I kind of always had that lens, perhaps. And I will say, I got very lucky because in 7th grade, I had this distinct experience so very interesting. So I came to the US and I was in 4th grade, and they tested me and they told my parents that I could jump a few grades basically if they'd wanted. And my parents said no. They said, oh my goodness, she's 9, she looks like she's 7, and you're not going to put her with 12-year-olds, right? This is not going to be good. So they said, okay. So they kept me in 4th grade, but I was very ahead based just on academically speaking. So I kind of coasted, to be honest. right? I didn't pay a lot. Again, I had bigger things to worry about at home than in school. And then I hit sort of seventh grade, and all of a sudden, the other kids had surpassed me. Like I was like, oh, you kind of wake up, and I'm like, oh wait, I've just been coasting this whole time, um, and by that time, I'd also somehow in my mind gotten it that I was not very smart. So that it maybe being I remember also when I first came to the US, we came to New York, which was actually a much easier experience than coming from New York to Texas, believe it or not. So coming to Texas, they put me in ESL. And I spoke English fluently. I mean, it is my first language. In like most, I would say Indians, middle class Indians, like you speak both languages, yours and English, and it's very normal. But it was because I didn't respond to Spanish. So they spoke to me in Spanish, and I just looked at them like I didn't understand what they were saying, and I didn't understand what they were saying.
Yeah.
And they put me in ESL for like 2 weeks
Oh my goodness.
until they figured out that it wasn't English, it was Spanish that was foreign to me, right? But I didn't look like I.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so get to seventh grade, and we have this substitute teacher who I, by the way, have never been able to track since then, and I've done a pretty good job of keeping in touch with many of my teachers. His name was Michael Weeks, and he was our history and English teacher. And after seventh grade, one class, he stopped me and he said, "Can you stay back?" And I was sitting all the way in the back of the classroom, like I'd already figured, I was like, "Oh, that's where I belong." And he said, "Can you stay back?" And I said, "Sure." I'm like, "Oh," and he said, "Listen," he said something so surprising. He said, "You seem very bright, and I'm sorry that I feel like the class is holding you back." And I was so confused because I was like, this guy doesn't know what he's. And I was like, uh-huh. And he's like, "Look, but if you work with me, I promise to challenge you. And I promise you won't be bored. And I'll really try if you'll try." And I thought this guy was just out of his mind. I was like, he's just got me confused with someone else or whatever. And I was like, whatever, you got it, right? Like, get out of here. But then funny things started happening. He would do things like, I would read an essay in class and he would be like, "That's amazing." He's like, "Class, stand up and applaud." Right? And I was like, so somewhere along that path, he got me thinking that maybe I wasn't as dumb as I had
Told yourself.
as I told myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was really a turning point, which then led to me entering a magnet program in high school and so forth. But yes, I guess all that to say that I don't think I'd be where I am if it wasn't for amazing teachers who took the time and got to, see whatever potential that maybe I didn't see in myself.
So did you have an idea of what you wanted to be when you grew up at that point?
Oh, goodness. So, I grew up also in a conservative, traditional family. And this is going to sound so foreign to most people. But you, as a woman, you were raised to get married and have children and be at home. That's not to say my parents were backwards or they didn't encourage it. It was just like kind of tradition or standard, right? Like I didn't. So there wasn't you will go to college and then like nothing like that. I just didn't grow up with that. So I think if you'd asked me, I would have said, yeah, I want to be a mom. As I got through high school, I found a real love for technology and journalism. I think those were my two passions, if you will. And so from that, I was like, this is really cool. Now, where that road would lead, no, I had no idea. I entered University of Texas at Austin, full scholarship. I entered with as a business major and quickly switched to communications because I just loved it so much. And again, it was professors, the people that I was learning from, I realized mattered a lot more to me than even the subject. And so, so comms and technology and all this fascinating stuff, which I had no idea would lead to the career that I have today. Like, no, I didn't. Even though both my parents were entrepreneurs, funnily enough, right? It was more as seen as a ways to make ends meet rather than like a profession that they had chosen. And, like most immigrants, right? It's like you have to create your opportunities. So yeah, that's and then I was undocumented for many, many years till I was 25.
Wow.
So when I graduated college, I was still undocumented.
So how did that impact how you viewed opportunities?
I realized that you had to create your own opportunities because I couldn't get an internship. I couldn't get a job. I couldn't, how, right? Like I didn't have papers. And I learned a lot about the system. So even though I'd come when I was 9 years old, because our application hadn't gone through by the time I turned 18 or 21, whatever it was, you get thrown out of your parents' application when you hit a certain age, like regardless of where it is in the process. And all of a sudden you're like in no man's land. And that's basically what happened to me. I didn't, and I remember because when I applied to grad school, I couldn't take the GRE. You have to present ID to take the GRE. I had no ID
Oh my goodness.
to take the test. But I was very honest. I went to my school and I said, listen, I can't take the GRE because I don't have papers. And they said, did you take a test? Did you take a practice exam? I said, I did. And they said, put down that score and we'll accept it, which was a huge gamble on their part. But I did my undergrad. So they knew me, right? I wasn't like a foreign student to them. I did my undergrad there and it was the same program. And I remember every semester, they would call me in and they would say, do you have a change? Like, can you take it now? Do you have a change in status? And I would say, no, I'm so sorry. It's still the same. So yes, I did grad school without ever having officially taken the GRE.
Wow. Wow. That definitely didn't pop up in my research. That's truly, it's both fascinating and just eye-opening to what can be a limiting factor that completely stands outside of your potential, your capacity, what you're able to do, that I'm sure most people wouldn't even bat an eye at. They wouldn't even think about how that's something that you, as a very talented person that now was in your, I would say, your lane of knowing what you could contribute. There was an opportunity. Somebody could have made a decision like, nope, doesn't happen. But someone made a decision that, no, we want to invest in you. And it gave you that opportunity to perform and to show what you're capable of, which is phenomenal.
It's so important, Matt. And right before, we hit record, because I asked you, I said, what is your show about? Like, what do your best guests bring to the table? And you told me, it's people see your breakthroughs, but they don't see the bin-throughs. And so, yeah, I'm sharing with you, things that I don't think I've ever shared publicly on a podcast before. And so, yeah, this is not very public information. If you Google me, you will not find the tales of my undocumented, youth.
Totally. So I do want to jump into your professional journey, because I just, as I was looking things up, it was fascinating to me what you've been able to do. And what I would argue is a very, limited amount of time. So your website shares that you are basically in the business of helping people find their Zen in the digital age. And as I thought about those two things and how they sit together, I couldn't think of too many other places that put Zen and digital together. You read a lot about being Zen and you read a lot about digital and where digital is going, but the combination I found fascinating. So I'm curious, how have you approached this combination of what you uniquely provide?
My first book that I wrote was called The Zen of Social Media Marketing. It went to 4 editions, and it was one of the first books on social media in ever. It was just so early days. And I remember because, the title and all of the ethos really came from, if people went with the flow of how people buy, and it's really at the heart of so much what we do. It is Zen. It's easier. It's when you try to kind of force your old school ways, or maybe like how it's always been done in a platform or arena that doesn't support it, right? Which is where you really have the challenge. And so this idea that if you create, for example, very, very micro, right, example of this, I tell people today that consumption is engagement. When people listen to this, when they read something on LinkedIn, that consumption is definitely engagement. Now, if you look at that and you say, well, I didn't get any comments, right? Nobody listened to this. And if you judge success on that, it's going to be anti-Zen. You're going to think it failed, but it didn't actually fail. Right? So to me, that's Zen. It's this idea that you go with the flow, that you build for the platform that you're playing to, you build for the people that you're serving and how they do business. And I think that's I think that's the biggest challenge you run into often, is that you find people trying to do things, with the medium they were familiar with, right? So when I first read the book, it was like people looked at social media and they thought, another advertising platform. So like, let's throw up the billboard. Let's push our message out there. only to be very frustrated because that's not the ethos of it. It's complete opposite, but it's very zen if you say, how do we build our brand? How do we build community? How do we add value? How do we think about this in a bigger way? And like that Barbie movie that just came out, they've done such a fabulous job of that, of utilizing all of that, right? And so yeah, to me that is what Zen really means.
So what led to you creating Zen Media?
A few factors collided, as often happens. I graduated with my master's in organizational communication and technology, and I'd done my thesis on Twitter, now known as Platform X. Yeah, so and I was just fascinated by, I think you mentioned journalism, social media, technology. I thought this was is going to be a game changer. And when I got out of school, this was, remember, 07, 08, super early days, before iTunes, before Airbnb, before TikTok, before Instagram, you only had Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. It's very, very basic. And I thought this is going to be a game changer for companies, how we communicate. This is huge. And yet, when I went out into the business world and pitched this, it was like, you're insane. What's Twitter? Facebook is something my kid uses. Those when kids used to use Facebook. And the reactions were just like, this is a fad. Like the internet was a fad. Like there was just still this. That's what I said, so anti-Zen, because still this kind of underlying theme of these are just trends that will feed it out, right? And so I think there I had a moment, obviously, to be able to say, how much do I believe in this? And I think the beauty of being 22 is you have so little to lose. So it's easy to roll the dice. And I think it'd be lying if I said otherwise. I was like, heck, I'll put out my shingle and I believe in this. And eventually many of those same companies became clients, which is really kind of cool to see that come full circle. And then also, as I mentioned, I didn't have papers. So I wasn't, and the funny thing about the US is you can start a business. You don't need papers to start a business.
Interesting.
You can pay your taxes. I've been paying my taxes since I was, 18 years old. They don't gladly, right? But but you can't get a job. So so we think all those factors kind of colliding was.
I have again, not to make it about me, but that's my favorite topic. I got my start in what was at the time called interactive marketing in that mid 2000s. And it was a similar thing where it was considered a fad. It was considered this it's a young people's thing. You're 22, 23, go figure that out for us and let the adults do the real marketing.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you could draw a parallel to what we're experiencing now and someone that's in their early 20s or mid 20s, how they should be thinking about taking advantage of this time where technology it's rapidly evolving. And now we as the older people aren't able to keep up with it. And there's a younger cohort that just lives in. I'm curious, what would you advise someone that is in a very similar time frame where they're probably saying things that people are kind of scratching their head and look at them like, what are you talking about? Take and talk. And what are you talking about? Content creators. And what are you talking about? This is a job.
Yeah.
What would you advise someone that is in a very similar position where they kind of got to make something out of nothing and using the time frame we're in to do that?
Yeah. So a couple of things I would say, don't say do, right? So my first customers, and Matt, you won't believe this, I didn't realize until a few years ago that most people started agencies after they left an agency and took the client roster with them. Nobody told me this, right? I thought you just had to know, be able to offer some value. I just didn't know. You don't know what you don't know. And I definitely didn't know anything about running a professional services organization or a business or anything. And I remember the initial ways I got my clients was I would go to conferences. And often I'd volunteer, right? Because I couldn't afford the pass. And I would say, hey, can I volunteer? And it's such an easy hack. If there's any industry you're interested in, go attend a trade show, go attend a conference. And I promise you, I don't know any organizer who will turn down a student emailing them and saying, hey, I want to volunteer, put me to work. And I would, why? They love that. And they don't get it enough. And guess what? Then the supply and demand, right? You're the one young person there among all these people in the industry. Such a great way also to figure out, do you love it? Do you want to do this? I remember for a minute, I wanted to be and anthropologist and an archaeologist. Like I was like, this history, I love history. So I was like, this is fascinating. And I was like, I will take an archaeology class. And I think these are my Tomb Raider fantasy days where I was like, Lara Croft, like sounds great. So I was like, you know what? This sounds great. I'm gonna go do this. So I remember going to a conference for archaeology. Oh my God, Matt. I was bored out of my ever loving mind. Like I didn't know that you could talk about rocks so much. Like I didn't. So one, I think for young people, like conferences, trade shows, like the industry that you learn, you don't figure out you don't want to do it or that you want to double down on it. Also, how I got my first clients, I would go to like I used to my first conference ever that I attended was Blog World and New Media Expo in Las Vegas. Like there weren't any there were just this was the same year South by came Interactive started. It had 200 people there.
Wow.
Right, compared to Interactive, which is like now 20,000. I've spoken there quite a few years. So I would go to these conferences and I would take notes in these sessions. And then I would say, does anybody want the notes? And I would collect business cards that way and send, because what did I have to offer? I had great note-taking ability, right? Just got out of school. Like they teach you how to take notes. I was like, all right, I can do that. So I think you have to start where you are, and I think you have to provide value. All the things. So this is still very important to me at Zen Media, and I tell my team this, and they know this, that we have to walk our talk. If we're talking thought leadership, we're doing it. If we're saying being on podcasts is important, I'm here. We're doing it. If we're saying PR is important, we're doing it. We've been blogging since '08. Right? Like I've been making videos, like all these things so I would say do the work. I think you do the work. And two, the challenge I think that this generation has and people starting today is that you see so much overnight success because it can happen because there's like, it's like every morning you wake up and someone won the lotto, right? And there is a digital lotto. And there are things that because of algorithms or whatever, people do go viral. But the amount of people that happens to, and using that as a strategy, I mean, that's challenging. So I guess all that to say, like, keep grinding. And it's not sexy, and it's not fun, and it's not easy. And most days you're like yelling into the abyss, like, did anybody hear me? Right? Like, does anybody even care? And it takes time and it takes consistency. And I still have people that are like, oh my God, I just discovered you. I'm like, oh, great. Only took 16 years.
Well, I think you had a lot of great points in there around do the work, grind, be able to provide value. But what's inherent to that is trading your most valuable resource, which is your time. So you have time to go volunteer at a conference, and there's going to be someone that can't do that. So how do you convert that time into something that someone else can't do that then you can provide them value on the other side? And I think that was inherent of like, hey, you have time to start the AI blog thing, whatever you want it to be, go do it. And, one of the things when I talk to college students specifically, I'm like, you start a podcast. It's a no regrets move. Like it literally, you could do it for 4 years and decide you don't want to do it, take it down. But what happens if that first time you get on the job and somebody asks you, what about your experience? Oh, I've been podcasting for 4 years. And it literally is something that anyone can do. And so I 100% agree with do the work. Don't worry about the overnight success because those things, yes, we think we see them, but they don't really happen that way. I think there are some flashes in the pan, but most people, they've probably tried so many other things that when it hits, it's like, oh, I figured that out. And I think we can sometimes assume that because we hear about them in a email thread or a newsletter, or they make it onto the Today Show, that happened overnight. So I 100% agree with everything you said.
I think it's just important to remember, like, again, how we engage with the internet looks different today. So I think even 15 years ago when I started all of this, it's different because we were, and it's funny because it's kind of like people were really happy about the internet and it wasn't a burden quite yet. And so like they were happy to give you their email address and they were like, they would leave comments. Like the novelty of internet has worn off. And so I think understanding that people consume publicly but share privately is a game changer, because then you won't measure yourself based on how are people responding publicly, like knowing that. I mean, listen, someone's going to listen to this podcast. Someone is listening to this right now. They're not going to drop you a note and say, Matt, I love that episode. They're just not. And
Yeah.
most likely they're not going to send me a note. Sometimes it happens. Send me a note on LinkedIn, like, heard you on this thing. Great. What's so much more common is like a year down the road, I'll talk to someone. They're like, "Oh yeah, I heard you." You never said, but nobody does. How many things do you listen to and consume? Do you leave a footprint? Do you leave comments? You just don't. And so, how do we share? We share in Slack. We share in Zoom. We share in emails. We share privately.
100%. You've written 2 books, and I'm curious, was author on that bingo card of things you wanted to do as you started to evolve and understand? And did you think you would do it twice?
A fiction author, sure. I liked writing. I was very good at creative writing. I won award. So I competed both in oratory in high school. So I did debate and oratory, and found like modicum success. Like I was good at it. And I think that eventually led to the keynote side of the career, because I've just been doing it since high school. Like I really enjoy it. And then writing was also something that, I won poetry contests, and I like creative writing. So I always thought if I write, I'd be a fiction writer, or like a history professor. I never thought about the nonfiction side of things. No, I wrote Zen from a place of need, because there wasn't anything out there. So people would ask questions, and I was like, man, like I need a resource to be able to direct people to. There's not a resource. So I wrote the resource. And then Momentum, same thing, which is why I haven't put out a 3rd book yet. Because I'm like, when I write a book, it's always been because I feel like something needs to be said or solved for that isn't already being said or solved for now. And so, so that's how author ended up on, or nonfiction author, I should say, ended up on the bingo card.
Well, 2 things I love about that. One, you talked about getting those reps early and being able to feel more confident, whether it's writing a book, being on a stage in front of many, many people, because you got the reps early on. Because I think we can sometimes not understand how getting those reps makes you just more confident and more comfortable. And it's just adding another chair into the room, or it's just, instead of poetry, you're now writing a few more pages. And if you've done it enough times, you can do it and be comfortable in doing that more in places that you probably would have never thought you would go. And then the second thing is how you're focusing in on what you think needs to be said versus wanting to be an author. And I think that's also key. Of if you have something to say and you don't see anyone else saying it, that probably means you should lean into it. And we can sometimes just assume, well, everyone thinks this way, or everyone is, thinking about X versus Twitter the same way. I was like, probably not. Probably you may have a unique insight given your experience and what you've been through. So I thought those are 2 points I just want to make sure I pulled out from what you shared. Mm-hmm. I want to switch to your personal brand for a little bit and ask you, what would you say is your superpower?
I thought about this one because before our interview here, you asked me, right, about my superpower. And so I would say, one, I'm very limited in superpowers. There's very few things I'm good at. My husband's very sweet, and he would disagree, but I will tell you that it's only because he's in love with me. I would say that being able to see what's next has always been a key part of my journey. And so I would say that is a superpower, and being able to connect the dots, where I think, again, maybe because I was always an outsider, that I'm just able to see things, to your point, Matt, like that lens, right, is just different. And so, it's interesting that you said that, because I do sometimes take things for granted, that I'm like, well, doesn't everybody feel this way? And it's like, no, maybe not everybody feels that way. I'll give you 2 superpowers, but I think they're related, right? It's like the ability to see what's next, and then the ability to connect what's happening to what's next.
I was just having a conversation with someone about this, and it's funny to me because I'm a firm believer you're the average of the company you keep. So if you spend 90% of your day with CEOs, that's how you're going to think. That's how you're going to act. On the other hand, if you spend 90% of your day with, pick the other side of the spectrum, that's going to be your world. And so I find it fascinating that you would say you only have a few superpowers, and you probably pick the two most important superpowers that you would want to have in business, of what being able to not only see what's next, but then to also connect the dots and what's happening. Because that's truly what any leader that's going to be successful needs to have some flavor of. And if you can have a superpower in those, I think that's truly fabulous. That's just always funny to me, because I'm sure the company you keep, you kind of look as, well, I know somebody does this really well. I know somebody does this really well. And I don't do that well. And we can obviously, I'm jealous of Superman because he flies, but that doesn't make the superpowers you have any less. And I just wanted to make sure yours are quite important and needed in our world.
Well,
so.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Sometimes I feel like I wish my superpower was that I was a better mother, because like it's hard. It's hard juggling work and family. And I love my kids to bits. I have a 4-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter. And there's moments where I'm like, I need more patience. Lord, grant me more patience. That would be a great superpower to have.
Well, that's a great segue. And you mentioned your husband, now we're talking about parenthood. How have wifehood and parenthood impacted your journey?
Game changers, right? I mean, wifehood, not so much, I will say, because my husband's also an entrepreneur and very supportive, and we're both very independent. So we have lots of things that we enjoy separately, and then time that we enjoy together. And so we're not that couple that does everything together. And that's great for us. Like we love that, right? So yeah, I don't think that changed my life very dramatically. Maybe it just like added to it. This is great. I mean, now I had a partner in crime, and we were both doing fun things that we loved and fulfilled us. And nice, because I had someone who understood employee challenges, or like making payroll, or like why I had to work late. Like it's never been a question, but I think that's less wifehood in the quality of your partner, I would say, right? So I'm very blessed that I have a really awesome husband who is who also understands the entrepreneurial journey and is incredibly supportive. I would say being a mom has been the hardest job I have ever had, and I think any mother who's listening would say that same. I mean, it is, you think you're the shit until you until it meets your 2-year-old, and you're like, no, never mind. Like it's very humbling. I will say this: having children is a very humbling experience, because they don't care. They don't care that CNN wants you. They don't care that you're running some multi-million-dollar campaign. They don't care. They just don't. They're like, what does that have to do with me? What is that? So it is. It's very humbling. It's fun. Like I said, there are days where I wish that I was more patient with them. It's also hard, and I hear people talk about the motherhood penalty, right? About how women's careers often take a back seat because they're moms, and I say, well, I call it just motherhood. I don't think it's a penalty. I think being a mom, it's a trade-off. It is. My days, and I work in 2 shifts. I work when they're at school, and then I spend time with them when they get home until I tuck them in. And then I work from 8 p.m. to sometimes 2 a.m. And that's my second shift, right? But other things give, because I don't really do brunch or go shopping or do some of the, like there's something does have to give. I mean, it is. And it is a trade-off, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. I also think it makes you a lot sharper with your time. Like I'm, much more cognizant of being productive, because I'm thinking, if I'm here and I'm not with them, then I better make sure this is really worth leaving them for.
You're 100% right. And I recently read The Power Code by Katty Kay, and I'm blanking on the other contributing author, but it really breaks down what you're talking about of like, there is no such thing as balance. And we as a society, unfortunately, we have different expectations for mothers and fathers. So if you walk into a house and let's say the laundry is on the couch and there's dishes and dishwasher, who are you going to judge? Are you going to judge, or which parent would you judge? And even in something as simple as that creates undue expectations on some of the people in the workforce than others. And it really broke it down in a way that because I'm a feminist, and I'm a girl dad, and I believe in equality and gender fairness, but it truly showed me that there's still things I'm doing that aren't going to lead to equity. And I do think that, your idea of, I'm doing the best I can, and I'm going to create these boundaries and the guardrails that allow me to do what I can do here. And when I'm not here, I'm with the family.
I'm also incredibly privileged, right? My husband and I are entrepreneurs. We have help. We have a community that the whole idea, it takes a village. Yeah, I couldn't do it without my village, not at work, not at home, right? So it's a very, I realize when I say these, yes, it is a very privileged way to be able to even talk about these things. But I think what's interesting and what's often lost in these equality conversations is the children. Because while we both work and we both have businesses and we both love what we do, for example, when my kids are sick and you give them they want mommy.
Yep. Yeah. Yep.
And that's not a ding on dad. Like, he's great, but that's just who they want, right? So, like, if they had a preference about who was going to work and who was staying, it was mom. And that's not true for all kids, but I would say the majority of the children that I know have a clear preference towards their mother. Not to say that dad is not their favorite person in the world.
Yep. And yeah, we have a little daddy's girl, but you're exactly right. When she's sick, where's mommy? And it doesn't matter what. Now, when she's better and wants to have fun, I'm back in the game. But speaking of privilege, have you had a mama we made it moment?
I've had many of those moments. I think because there's still a part of me, a big part of me, that can't believe that I get to do the things that I do and live the life that I get to live and serve the people, like to be in these rooms. And, I think it's a big, but I don't know if I ever feel like I'm there, because I think I mean, for me, it's a journey. And so there's moments, right? When you land that first client, when I made Forbes 30 under 30 list, when there's certain moments that I'm like, wow, like, this is way beyond anything that I would have imagined. Recently, we put my son in school, and the school he's going to get to go to was something that I could have only dreamed as a child. It wasn't on the table. And I think as a parent, being able to provide those things for my children, I think is probably the closest I get to, like, we made it moments. But then I'm also acutely aware of the sacrifices it's taken, not just me, right? But my parents, my grandparents, and their parents, just genealogy and people who've sacrificed so these kids can have the life that they do. And I think as a parent, it also makes me have, something maybe I'll work towards as they get a little bit older, but having a high bar to say, man, I hope these kids appreciate it, because, they're just, our lives are built on the sacrifices of others. And my father-in-law served in Vietnam. My grandfather-in-law was in World War II, and we have their uniforms up at home.
Wow.
Like, in my library, if you ever come visit, Matt, I'll give you a tour. But we have that as a reminder for the kids. Like, these freedoms were hard fought, and to bring it kind of full circle, it's why I'm actually a big proponent of building your brand. I think especially if you are a person of color, if you are a woman, because I always like to tell people, every door that you break down, that's one more door that you get to now hold open for everybody else to walk through. Right? And people often think, like, personal branding or whatnot, they think like it's a selfish, or like it's so self-involved. I'm like, it's the exact opposite, because you can't do for others what you don't have, right? Like, it's your cup has to flow it over. So your cup has to be full, which means you have to have platform and voice and a place at the table to advocate for others. If you don't have that, how are you going to do that for other people?
100% well said. And I appreciate you sharing that. I've almost felt like you had a camera in my house, because we literally are having those conversations with our kids of like, you don't understand the how good you have it. and I literally, with our 4-year-old, I was trying to have this conversation around trying your best. And I'm never going to be disappointed in you if you try your best. And it was just like trying to, because it's a balance, because you want them to understand there's so many things you have access to that we didn't have, our parents didn't have, our grandparents wouldn't even like fathomed. But then at the same time, I don't want to add pressure. I don't want that to feel like a weight of everyone that came before you. And so it's a very tricky, parenting is a tough one, because there's no book and there's no KPIs. We just try our best, and every day we show up.
There's a great Persian poem. It's really short. It says, "I was a soldier, so my son could be a merchant, so his son could be a poet."
Very, very well said. I'm going to close this out and hopefully have a little bit more fun. When they turned your life story into a movie, who would you want to play you on the big screen?
Oh, goodness. Maybe Mila Kunis, right? Dark hair. She's kind of a shorty. And then she's married to a really tall dude. And I am too. So like, yeah.
What song would play in your trailer?
I mean, I kind of want to say anything by Taylor Swift, just because I'm such a Swiftie and a fan. So yeah, let's just go with that.
So I'm a huge fan of stories. It's why I do the podcast. The last name doesn't hurt. But I think there's so much you get from just sitting with someone and hearing their firsthand experience, and you can take away and apply it in your life. But for you, if there were 3 people, you could sit with them. They could be with us. They could have passed on, but hear their stories firsthand. Who would be your 3?
Well, I'll keep it in the business realm, right? Because I think there's so many ways that you can go with this. But Abraham Lincoln, I think that would be just a fascinating, right? All the things that he had to overcome. Teddy Roosevelt, another, wartime hero of kind of leadership and all the things that he had to go through and lead the country through. And then, I mean, I think this is, I think MLK would be amazing, just to be in the presence, I think, of someone who, and Matt, if you haven't read A Letter from Birmingham, it's just like, it's probably one of the best pieces of, I'll say, literature, right, of history ever written. Like I can't read that without crying. It's like, but to meet him would just be an honor. I don't know if I have any questions, but I think it would just be an honor to meet the author of that piece, and someone who broke down so many barriers for people of color. And I won't just say, not just African Americans, right? But really led the movement for equality. So yeah, those are my 3.
I find it fascinating that the Zen of digital age picked 3 people not from the digital age. And it speaks to your love for history and your ability to see things and to pull from the past into the future. So is there anything I didn't ask that you want to share, or anything you want to ask me?
I do want to ask you something. What is your superpower?
These are always evolving, but I think the one that is probably front and center that I rely on the most is my ability to make the complex easier to understand and synthesize. And so my team makes fun of me because I speak in metaphors. And so I always find a way to take something we're talking about and to bring a metaphor in to explain it, to hopefully help people know, like, oh, okay, that's what that means. But that's probably one that I use the most. The other one, the podcast, is just moderating. I feel like I have the ability to lead a conversation, even if it is multiple people, if it is, and hopefully guiding it to the place we want it to go. But those are my 2 of mine, I would say.
Well, I will add a 3rd for you. I think you're a great listener, Matt. Like I've done probably 1,000 podcasts by now, and I know if you're watching this on video, I guess maybe you can see the eye contact and the connection and whatnot. But yeah, I just want to say that you're a very good listener.
Thank you very much. And that means a lot coming from you, being you are in this world Before I let you go, though, if people want to follow you, they want to know what your story is up to, where should I send them?
Send them to Zen Media. That's kind of where that's home base. And then if they want to connect with me on LinkedIn, that's usually where I am most at home, so to speak.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. I also appreciate you sharing your been-throughs and just being open and transparent and authentic. This has been a lot of fun, and look forward to watching your story as it continues forward. Until next time, I encourage you, as always, to continue to share your story. It's so important, not only for you, but for others to hear your story. And if you have any feedback or any comments about any of the